Good morning. I hope everybody's having a good day. And I hope the fact that it took a long time to load doesn't mean it's not recording well. Today, it's going to be a bit of a hodgepodge. I'm not going line by bit or line through Act 2 or anything like that. What we're going to try to work on is tying together a few things from the paper, trying to tie together a few things from the discussion, trying to take a look at a few things in the textbook and tie them to things that we have talked about already. Let's get on with it, shall we? First of all, for the paper, from page 1390 in the textbook, it talks about Shakespeare confronts spectator and reader with fundamental problems of human existence. What is the nature of love? What is the nature of family? What is the nature of service? What is the nature of justice? What is the nature of nature? All right, a little bit meta there, I suppose. To examine these questions, he has fashioned an immense theatrical and poetic structure in which such human problems are dramatized, questioned, worried over, reconsidered, but never answered. Now, again, remember, one of the questions on that you have in the prompt is, does Shakespeare answer any of those questions? You, I think, can say that Shakespeare hints that the nature of love is X, or Shakespeare hints that the nature of service is Y, or that family is Z. All right? What point does he make about justice? You can say he seems to indicate that justice is, and then fill in the blank. And then you can say the book is correct and he never answers it, or you can disagree and say there is an answer, and here's how that answer is developed. On page 1393 from the book, the play seems to examine, define, and weigh the positives and negatives of human existence. Are men and women naturally good or naturally wicked? If you're watching this, there should be a question mark there. Is the natural world mainly benign or is it fundamentally brutal? I talked in class about the Thomas Hobbes theory that the life in the state of nature was nasty, brutish, and short. I talked about the Locke theory that was a little bit more optimistic and indicated that it was more benign, certainly, than Hobbes, and that people still needed security and still had to give up rights for security. Those are the sorts of things that are happening here. And again, the natural world, we're looking at the storm on the heath. We're looking at the natural world as in, because there is no kingdom, they've reverted to a state of nature. Edmund is revolting against the whole idea of rules. And so if he reverts to that natural world, is he going to create a benign world or a fundamentally brutal world if we follow Edmund? And then from the Norton Shakespeare, a book that I've used before, Shakespeare's play could assume its true stupendous proportions, enabling the reader to grasp its ultimate meaning. That meaning, the great 20th century critic A.C. Bradley wrote, is that we must renounce the world, hate it, and lose it gladly. The idea here, I think, that we must hate the world, we must renounce the world, we must lose it gladly, still opens a lot of questions. Why is this true? What is causing that hate? Do we have to lose it gladly? But there is the hint here that there is a meaning. And therefore, if there is a meaning, some question or another has to have been answered. And one more. It is a sign of Lear's astonishing freedom from orthodoxy that it refuses to offer any of the conventional answers to this question. And the question was about the conclusion of the play: why should some things be able to breathe when one of the characters has died and can no longer breathe? Answers that largely serve to conceal or deflect the mourner's anguish. Shakespeare's tragedy asks us not to turn away from evil, folly, and unbearable human pain, but seeing them face to face to strengthen our capacity to speak the truth, to seek justice, and to love. If you take a look here, strengthening the capacity to speak the truth, to seek justice, and to love, I think is more optimistic than some of the other things we've talked about. It's more optimistic than some of the things we will talk about, or some of the theory we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And the idea that even if there are no firm answers to all of these big questions, there is still an admonition to do something good, to do something important, to live life in a way that has a moral code behind it. Also, I want to talk about this idea of maybe Shakespeare hid a Christian element in the play. If you take a look at this idea of can we find meaning in life? Are there answers to these ultimate questions in life? The book of Ecclesiastes asks an important question in chapter 1, or makes an important statement in chapter 1. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. We'll come back to that, and I think I will call it nihilism here in a little bit. But, what do people gain from their labors under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth is going to remain. Streams flow into the sea, and the sea is never full. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. There's nothing new under the sun. And no one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. And so this is just the whole idea of life is totally and completely meaningless. However, if we have an action, as the Norton quotation on the previous slide said, to speak justice, to seek justice and speak the truth, for example. Ecclesiastes comes to the same sort of conclusion. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Also from the Old Testament, Micah. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly. Goes back to the green-black quotation. To love mercy, I think, can tie into the green-black location. And to walk humbly with your God. One of the things when I pulled this off of the web had the idea of humbly being a synonym for prudently. All of these things, I think, if Greenblatt is correct in his quotation, then I do think it's important to think about, was Shakespeare hiding an element of grace in there, even though the pagan setting and all of the meaningless talk and meaningless actions, all of the destruction of the kingdom, of the family bonds, of the body, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, all of those things still had this idea that if everything is meaningless, keep the commandments. This is the duty of all mankind. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. Maybe Shakespeare hid that Christian element, that bit of grace in there. It's worth thinking about. In class, we talked about nihilism, and I gave a definition that I think included the first sentence almost word for word. Nihilism is the belief that values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated. It's often associated with extreme pessimism and a radical skepticism that condemns existence. A true nihilist would believe in nothing and have no loyalties. And again, remember when I was talking about the emphasis on nothing, all of the talk about nothing, that nothing can come from nothing, even though most of the creation stories have something coming from nothing. No loyalties, we're seeing that in the play. No purpose, perhaps, except an impulse to destroy. We're certainly seeing that from Edmund. Nihilism is often associated with Friedrich Nietzsche, who argued that its corrosive effects would eventually destroy all moral, religious, and metaphysical convictions and precipitate the greatest crisis in human history. The idea that belief in nothing will lead to destruction, I think, is something that Shakespeare is certainly hinting at in King Lear. Nihilism, I think, is going to tie into deconstruction because Jacques Derrida, one of the great founders, for lack of a better word, of deconstruction, along with Michel Foucault, both of them, I think, traced their philosophical roots to everything through Nietzsche. And so there's a kind of a discussion of nihilism and an emphasis on nothing throughout their work. Let's take a look at the definition I gave you earlier in the semester. Language is not a precise instrument, but a power whose meanings are caught in endless web of possibilities that cannot be untangled. We'll come back to the language thing and Lear in particular here in just a few minutes. It talks that any given text has irreconcilably contradictory meanings rather than being a unified logical whole. Deconstruction is not a dismantling of the structure of a text, but a demonstration that it has already dismantled itself. Its apparently solid ground is no rock but thin air. And again, we'll come back to that with Lear taking his daughter's speeches at face value. They were not solid. The belief system was all nothing but air. Hot air, perhaps, instead of thin air, but there was no basis to it. Here's the mention of Jacques Derrida and his idea of the opposites. We've talked about the dichotomies, white and black, masculine, feminine, cause and effect, all of those things. Derrida suggests that these oppositions are hierarchies in miniature. In other words, that they are power structures in miniature, and that these power structures are giving us positive or superior and negative and inferior. And he wants to erase the boundaries between binary oppositions and to throw the hierarchy into question. And because we're going to erase the boundaries, because we're going to erase the hierarchy, we are now arguing in effect that nothing can be known. We are arguing in effect that there is nothing that is an absolute. And excuse me for taking the easy way out, but by arguing that nothing is absolute, we are ignoring the fact that we have just created an absolute. And again, it's an easy way out, but I do think deconstruction has its own thread that can be pulled and its own thread that unravels the theory immediately. King Lear's particular idealism, this is from 1392 in her book, and both of these are from page 1392, by the way, is his belief that words and meanings correspond to each other. So in other words, the deconstructionist is going to love this idea that the words and meanings in Lear do not correspond to each other, and that if you believe that they do, you reap this whirlwind, you reap this madness, you wind up with nothing, and you're reminded that there is no moral absolute. Okay? Our textbook talks about the contents of Lear's vision are erroneous, but nonetheless desirable. The world would be a better place if he were right. Yet, given the conditions of a tragic environment, such belief is also a serious mistake. The idea that the world Lear lives in can have no absolute meaning, I think, is perhaps inherent within the play. I think there's one spot where we can start looking to absolute meaning, and I want to go back to the Norton textbook to talk about that. The Norton Shakespeare, Greenblatt, who is a famous Shakespearean scholar and who wrote the essay that is in that book, brilliant modern stage performances and more recently films have underscored not only the play's acute theatrical sophistication and self awareness, but also its emphasis on the body's inescapable centrality. If Shakespeare explores the extremes of the mind's anguish and the soul's devotion, he never forgets that his characters have bodies as well, bodies that have needs, cravings, and vulnerabilities. And I think you'll see Edmund, you'll see Lear, you'll see the emphasis on the body with the blinding. And I think that emphasis on the body allows us to once again bring back questions about absolutes. And I'm going to quote another scholar. It's a book that I've enjoyed reading several times. When I was a debate coach, I used this book for several arguments as we would get into weird theory arguments sometimes in debate. But from Terry Eagleton, this book is After Theory. It is because of the body, not in the first place because of Enlightenment abstraction, that we can speak of morality being universal. The material body is what we share most significantly with the whole of the rest of our species, extended both in time and space. Of course, it is true that our needs, desires, and sufferings are always culturally specific, but our material bodies are such that they are indeed must be, in principle, capable of feeling compassion for any others of their kind. It is in this capacity for fellow feeling that moral values are founded. And this is based in turn on our material dependency on each other. The fact that we can condemn the daughters for their treatment of Lear, not just because of the family bond, but because of the body being tossed out on the moor in the middle of the storm and being put at risk. Yes, the mind had weakened. Yes, everything else has weakened. But the fact that we get to condemn the daughters, it does strike me as an indication that the nihilism in the play is something that needs to be condemned. And that Shakespeare is trying to show that if we throw away all convention, we get a world where life is nasty, brutish, and short. I think I've said some of this in class before. I apologize if a lot of this is repetition, but I do think that talking about the definition of nihilism, its connection to the deconstruction, its connection to this idea of nothing, and the emphasis of nothing in the play contrasted with the emphasis on the body in the play, or at least the discussion of the body in the play, brings us back to perhaps there's a little bit of hope hidden in the play, and that hope can be involved in let's just treat each other a little bit better. For today's daily writing, there's one more thing. I want to talk about the words and meanings for a second. Because the Earl of Kent, when he attacks Oswald, and when he insults him as a knave and a rascal and a three-suited, which means he can only buy 3 suits, which is all the working man could afford. £100 was what you paid to get a knighthood. In other words, he didn't earn a knighthood, he paid to get it. The worsted stocking is the idea that if he were a true gentleman, you would wear silk stockings. All of this is in your book. Lily-livered means coward. We've talked about that before. The son of a whore, glass gazing. The book talks about the fact that a mirror was the glass. Super serviceable, in other words, he'll do anything. The idea that he's almost a pimp. All of that, I think, all of those words had meaning. I think Kent meant them. And I just think this is one of the best rants I've ever seen. It makes me smile every time I read it. It's one little bit of joy in the play. And as we talk about the bits of joy in the play, remember that there's a certain irony here, because usually the fool is the one who was supposed to bring the laughs. The clowns were the ones who were supposed to bring the laughs. Here, I think Kent's insult of Oswald brings the laugh. The fool brings the wisdom. And for the daily writing, we've had 3 class periods. One of them was discussing the paper, but we talked about Act 1 pretty extensively. I've tried to tie together some of the discussions to preview what's going to happen here as far as bad crap that's going to go on through the play. But you guys should be half through or more. Where are you in the play? How's the reading going? What do you like about it? What don't you like? Why? Just give me an honest feedback about Lear. I think it's a great play. I think it's also a difficult play. Hope everyone has a good weekend, and we'll pick this back up on Monday. One quick thing, I think there will be a quiz next Friday, and I believe we end this play next Friday as well. And so be looking for the quiz then, and the presentations as well. Everybody have a good weekend.